The Giants agreed to a one-year deal with Mike Yastrzemski, and they tendered contracts to LaMonte Wade Jr. and a few others. So while it might seem like they're running it back with these guys, that's just not necessarily the case.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on the show we provide episodes 3 days a week for now, talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, been hosting this show since prior to the 2019 season, and I'm a lifelong Giants fan. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, so check us out there if you have not already, and please hit that subscribe button wherever it is that you're following the show. You can start the NFL season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And where we get started is by discussing the fact that the Giants, the first player personnel moves under the Buster Posey regime, which I still can't believe that I'm saying that. But, finally some decisions were made in recent days. They added some players to the 40-man roster to protect them from the Rule 5 draft. We'll get into that later. But more significantly to me was the tender deadline on Friday, also known as the non-tender deadline. For the Giants, it was more of the tender deadline than the non-tender deadline. And so the most significant case was that of Mike Yastrzemski, because he was going to be entering his fourth year of arbitration eligibility. And so the price gets increasingly high as you get closer to free agency. And most players get only 3 years of arbitration. Yastrzemski got 4 because he was in the top 22% of players in terms of service time when he was in his second year of service time. It's a little bit confusing, but that's known as a Super 2. So anyway, the estimate that MLB Trade Rumors put out that Yaz would be able to make through this process of arbitration was $9.5 million. And so that number starts to be more of a number that is not really a bargain, but also not really an overpay, more of like a fair value number. And so when you combine that with the fact that the Giants, A, need to improve their team, obviously coming off an 80 and 82 season, and B, we have heard that they intend to reduce spending from 2024. So you put out a certain amount of money that got you to an 80 and 82 record, and now you want to cut spending and improve. So I think our last episode was all about how are they going to do that? And so you might think, well, one of the ways you could do it is by not tendering a contract to a player like Yastrzemski and using that money elsewhere on a better player. Because then if you tie it up in Yastrzemski, where do you improve? Not only how do you do it financially, but where do you do it on the field? Because bringing Yastrzemski back takes up a spot, and already their outfield is set. If Yaz is kind of the everyday right fielder, when you look at Elliot Ramos, what he was able to do this year has earned certainly a shot at that starting role in left field in 2025. Jung-Hoo Lee definitely going to be holding down center field, coming off his injury. And then Yaz. And so you've kind of locked up your outfield. And so I understand the thinking by some when you say, well, why then did they do this? So what they ended up doing was they actually agreed to a 2025 salary. So Yastrzemski and the Giants agreed to a 1-year, $9.25 million deal. It is the final year of his team control. So he is a free agent at the end of 2025. This deal, I believe, is just like locked in. Arbitration salaries are not guaranteed, as we saw through with what happened with J.D. Davis. But I think it's different with when you agree to terms. That's more, or just if you go to a hearing. But this was avoiding the hearing. And so the thing to note is that just because you agree to a deal with a player like this doesn't mean that you're locking yourselves into having that player on your roster even tomorrow. Like, the Giants are free to trade Mike Yastrzemski today. Like, there's nothing stopping them, just like any other player on their roster. So this was just simply a matter of determining, do you want to bring this player, or do you want to retain this player, or do you want to just cut them loose and set them into free agency with no cost to you? And the Giants determined that there was at least par value in a $9.25 million Mike Yastrzemski for 1 year. And I don't know, if you look at the other outfield options that are out there, you're not going to find, that's actually a reasonable price. And so maybe they do just look to make a significant upgrade elsewhere. Maybe it's pitching and a really good shortstop, and they don't touch the outfield. And maybe, this whole conversation could be had about LaMonte Wade Jr. as well. For Wade and Tyler Rogers and Camilo Doval and Austin Warren, they agreed to an actual salary, which is like basically the league minimum salary. He was arbitration eligible, but it's less than $1 million that he's going to be making. But for Wade, Rogers, and Doval, they just tendered contracts, which is to say they simply didn't release their rights to these players. Because if they had non-tendered them, those players just immediately become free agents. And so the estimated salaries, if it were to go to an arbitration hearing, for Wade is $4.7 million, for Tyler Rogers $5.5 million, for Camilo Doval $4.6 million. All of those represent significant, bargains. It's not like, oh my God, they're tens of millions of dollars underpaid, but it's at the same time, you just got to consider, in Major League Baseball on the open market, like, players cost a lot of money. And this was a couple years ago now, but I have Dan Zimborski, it was mid 2013 that he wrote this, but there was some analysis of what is a win above replacement cost, and it's not linear. So the first teams pay less for the first win above replacement than they do for all the rest of them. And so that's what Dan Zimborski, the creator of Zips projections, found. That in mid 2023, his analysis was that the first WAR costs about $5.3 million, and subsequent WAR costs $9.3 million. And so using that methodology, a 2-WAR player, which is like an average Major League starting caliber player, costs about $14.6 million per year, just to give you some context. And Yaz and Wade, like, these guys are in that echelon. And so when you're talking, if those guys cost $14.5 million on the open market for 1 year, then, it's, Yaz sometimes maybe is a little below that 2-WAR threshold, but even 1.5 is about $10 million. And so Yaz doesn't have to do much to be worth this contract, is what I'm saying. And especially Wade. They're paying Wade at the rate of less than a 1. Actually, they haven't agreed to an official contract for Wade yet, but my point, the estimate is going to be pretty accurate. And so that's why I say Wade is underpaid, and same for Rogers and Doval. Relievers WAR is just not a great way to evaluate them, it doesn't. They throw so few innings that it's hard to rack up wins above replacement as a reliever. It doesn't mean they're paid on a different scale, basically, is what I'm saying. This doesn't really apply to relievers. But anyway, just because they agreed to this contract with Yaz, and just because they tendered contracts to Wade, Doval, and Rogers, doesn't guarantee them anything in terms of being on the roster. And the Giants could still free up that money. It was simply a matter of, do we want to release these players into free agency? So we will get into more on this topic, and also the Giants adding 2 Carsons to their 40-man roster and a couple non-tenders as well. We'll get into all of that in just a minute. And before we do, today's episode of Locked On Giants is brought to you in part by Omaha Steaks. Nothing delivers comfort and joy quite like the unrivaled quality and taste of Omaha Steaks. This year, skip the holiday hustle and bustle and save 50% off site-wide during their cyber sale at omahasteaks.com. Plus, get a $30 reward card when you shop early and score an extra $30 off with promo code MLB. With 5 generations of experience, Omaha Steaks consistently delivers the world's best steak experience, and their gifting experts have made it easy to deliver the perfect gift with thoughtfully curated gift packages starting at $89.99. From legendary steaks to mouth-watering desserts and more, save 50% off site-wide during their cyber sale at omahasteaks.com. Plus, our listeners get an extra $30 off with promo code MLB and a $30 reward card when you shop early. That's 50% off at omahasteaks.com and an extra $30 off with promo code MLB. Minimum purchase may apply. All right, as promised, we're going to get more into this topic. And I want to get into the story of Mike Yastrzemski and why I'm particularly and objectively pleased about something to do with him. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On MLB, where host Sully has you covered all offseason on the biggest stories around the league and during the season as well, of course. Yeah, just because they tendered these contracts doesn't necessarily mean anything. And it's, there was some thought as to a couple of things with Yaz. Like, there was the possibility of a non-tender, given that salary is not a massive bargain at all. I think it's like kind of just fair. And then they also, Yastrzemski himself had talked about how he wanted to come back. This was like towards the end of the season. Somebody got quotes of him saying he wanted to be back. He understood where he was, like in arbitration and all that, and that he would even be willing to spread it out over a couple of seasons. So say, they end up agreeing to this $9.25 million. So you could pay him, he was open to something like, I don't know, a $5 million salary each of the next 2 years, something like that. But in the end, the Giants and he elected for this deal. And so some of you have expressed frustration or you wish that they had done that. First of all, there's 2 things I'll say. It wouldn't have saved them much money. We're talking like, okay, if you do that, you're saving like $4.25 million for this year. And secondly, you've got to think about next year's payroll as well, because suddenly you're adding money to next year's payroll that now is not on the books. And so it's not a huge deal to me that it wasn't spread out in that way. But I wouldn't be shocked if Yastrzemski ends up on another team prior to opening day. I also wouldn't be shocked if they keep him in the fold because it's not too much to pay. And then it also keeps their outfield flexible, and it gives them a chance to have an open spot going into next year. Maybe some of these young players that they have coming up, maybe somebody like seizes a role for 2026, just like we saw Elliot Ramos do in 2024. going into 2025. Like, if you look at their roster right now, I mean, perhaps Tyler Fitzgerald, maybe, someone breaks through in the infield and Tyler Fitzgerald has to move to the outfield, or Grant McCray is someone who has, warranted a look, certainly. And then they've got a number of other outfield options coming up through the minor leagues. Marco Luciano, I was trying to think who else. He's moving to the outfield. And so, having Yaz there maybe gives you more flexibility to be able to play a Marco Luciano versus if you tie yourself in. I'm not saying, don't go and sign Juan Soto because Marco Luciano is now playing outfield. No, if you have the chance to get Soto, to me, you go and get Soto and then trade Luciano, whatever it takes, trade Yaz and Luciano to clear that spot. Also, Luis Matos, of course. Wade Meckler is on this 40-man roster. And, other guys are coming. James Tibbs the third, who was their top draft pick this year. He's perhaps farther away, but nonetheless, just keeping their options open is one of the benefits of bringing back Yaz. But again, it's no guarantee that he ends up actually being on the roster on opening day. But I just wanted to say, I sent this out on Twitter and I'm just going to kind of read it. But I am objectively happy to see that Yaz will now have earned $27 million in his 4 years of arbitration. And it is a great redemption story for a guy who toiled away for 6 years in the Orioles minor league system without ever getting a major league opportunity. And this was when the Orioles were like the worst team in the league, routinely losing over 100 games. Maybe they thought Yaz might help them and they didn't want help. Maybe they were truly, truly tanking. I don't know. That doesn't seem right, because you could, if you're really going down that road, you could have a player like Yastrzemski break through and then trade him and continue to be bad. It just seems to me more like a misevaluation of Yaz by the Orioles. And it's not like Yastrzemski is a superstar, but this was another thing I wanted to point out, was that Fangraphs gives us a kind of dollar value for a player's production every year. They don't use that calculation, I don't think, that Dan Szymborski I was talking about earlier, where that first win in a win above replacement is worth less than the subsequent ones. And think about that. That makes sense. Like, players who are just producing barely above replacement level, teams don't want to pay a lot for that. What they pay for is the production kind of way beyond that level. That's what teams pony up for. And so it's not a straight, like I said, linear calculation where each win above replacement is worth like $9 million, which previously, or $12 million previously, that's kind of how people thought about it. It's kind of a curve where the first one's worth less and then the subsequent ones are worth more. But anyway, regardless, Fangraphs this may not be accurate to a T, and WAR is inherently not meant to be taken super precisely, but an estimate here is that in his 6 seasons with the Giants, Yastrzemski has produced about $90 million of value. And also, by the way, never less than $12 million of value in a single season. So when you say, oh my gosh, $9.25 million, what the heck? He's never produced less than $12 million of value in a season, according to Fangraphs, and $90 million in his 6 seasons, 694 games with the Giants. People talk about batting average, but what Yastrzemski does that's above average is when he gets his hits, he hits for power. He hits, he's consistently in the 18-ish home run range, which is not super high, but it's not like 4 or 7, it's 18 home runs, and he plays good right field. If you look at the defensive metrics, in his career, 21 defensive runs saved in right, 4 outs above average, and in center, 9 defensive runs saved, 1 out above average. So a capable center fielder as well, which, I think it was Alex Pavlovich wrote that was perhaps part of the thinking here, was that if Jung-Hoo Lee needs a little bit of time to get ready for it, like if there's any setbacks at all with him, Yaz can play center and capably. So anyway, it's just, to me, like, for a guy who never got a chance in for bad Orioles teams, the Giants, this is where perhaps you're going to, not you specifically per se, but perhaps the Giants ultimately will come to miss the strengths of Farhan Zaidi. We don't know exactly who it was who saw something in Yastrzemski that other teams didn't see, and LaMonte Wade Jr. for that. I'm forgetting how I'm trying to say what I'm trying to say, but for that matter, and Wade for that matter, right? This was what Zaidi was good at, was finding these undervalued players who turned into legitimate contributors. Like $90 million of value is $90 million of value. And, the Orioles essentially thought this guy's going to provide no value. That was their evaluation. But in fact, he provided much more than that. And so for him to turn that into making $27 million, and that's not counting his 2 pre-arbitration years when he earned about $500,000, a little more in each year. So he ends up earning about $28 million in his time with the Giants. I would imagine this is probably his last year with the Giants, if he is in fact even on the Giants this year. But they won't necessarily be the ones paying him if they were to trade him. But still, like, the Giants have committed this kind of money to him over 4 years, which is not a lot, but it's a lot for just a normal human living on this earth, but it's not a lot in baseball terms. But $27 million for Yaz, it just makes me objectively happy. And he did it. Like, he made it all the way through. He's the longest tenured Giant. So anyway, I'm happy to see that. Even if he ends up elsewhere, that money is his. He earned it, and it wasn't guaranteed. And you definitely might, if you're in that position, think about like quitting baseball. If you're just playing 6 years in the minors with no opportunities, getting called up for a team that's losing 100 games a year, you might think about quitting. And I think he did, but he stuck with it, and is just so grateful that Farhan Zaidi and the Giants gave him a chance. And here he is now, $27 million later. So happy to see that. And the same goes for all the others, just happy to see that Wade, Rogers, Doval, guys who got a chance with the Giants, making some money. I'm just happy to see that. So coming up in just a minute, we're going to get into the non-tenders and also the players who were added to the 40-man roster to protect them from the Rule 5 draft. A couple of Carsons, 2 Carsons. We'll get into it in just a minute. And before we do, today's episode of Locked On Giants is brought to you in part by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, here we go. We're going to get into the deadline for adding players to the 40-man roster to protect them from the Rule 5 draft. Never get tired of saying that sentence. And the Giants did protect a couple of players, and they also designated someone for assignment, and that player was then non-tendered. So it's a little bit complicated, I guess, but ultimately, the at the end of the day, the Giants added Carson, Ragsdale, right-handed pitcher, and right-handed pitcher Carson Seymour to that 40-man roster. And so this is another thing that I wanted to point out. Carson Ragsdale and Carson Seymour are players who were acquired for very little under the Farhan Zaidi regime. So Ragsdale was acquired in the Sam Coonrod trade, and if you look at what he's done, I mean, and you look at the projections, the Steamer projections for Carson Ragsdale, who is 26 years old, will turn 27 in May, projection of a 3.78 ERA out of the bullpen with a solid strikeout rate, just kind of solid projections across the board by Steamer, a projection system featured on Fangraphs. This guy's been a starter his entire minor league career outside of 2 games. He's pitched, and when the Giants acquired him, he hadn't played it looks like professional baseball at all. He was drafted in 2020, and I think the Giants traded Coonrod in the 2020 offseason, 2021 offseason. And so once again, a player that was undervalued by another team, Coonrod has gone on to not be very good. And, we don't know yet what's going to come of Carson Ragsdale, but the fact that a new regime under Buster Posey, a lot of the same people still in place, but nonetheless, valued this guy enough to add him to the 40-man. Yeah, I'm looking up Coonrod's numbers. He's got a career 5.54 ERA in 104 innings, didn't pitch in the major leagues last year. Yeah, not very good. And I don't know, so you'd rather have Carson Ragsdale right now than 32-year-old Sam Coonrod, and who never ended up pitching all that well. And the projections, again, for Ragsdale are pretty good. So congratulations to him. Getting on the 40-man is a big deal. Changes your life dramatically and makes you way more likely. I mean, you have to be on the 40-man to play in the majors. So getting on there, you then start your option year thing. So if you aren't in the majors, teams only can option you for 3 years, and then you are out of options, and then you can end up somewhere else. So anyway, it's a big deal to get added. And then for Carson Seymour, he is 25, and he was acquired in the Darren Ruff trade. So that was another trade that the Giants got stuff for what amounted to nothing. Darren Ruff, I mean, he was really good when he was good with the Giants, but then he just kind of fell apart in that, was it 2022 season? And the Giants ended up trading him. They got J.D. Davis. They got Thomas Zapucki, who got injured but was otherwise really promising. They got Carson Seymour, and they got another player. So they got all these guys for Darren Ruff, who ended up continuing to struggle with the Mets. And I don't even know what Darren Ruff is up to now, but I don't believe he played at all in the major leagues last season. He may have gone back to, I don't know. He didn't. He was way below average in 22 and 23, and didn't play in the majors in 24. And I don't know what he's up to. Yeah, he became a free agent in November 2023, and that was the last that he was heard of. I think he was hired by some team or school, I forget, but that's beside the point. The point is about Carson Seymour, who the Giants got in that trade. And again, a guy who's done mostly starting since joining the Giants. He was in high A with the Mets when he joined the Giants, went to high A with the Giants, then double A, then triple A, where he made 29 appearances, 28 starts last season. And again, the projections are very strong, and a heavy ground ball projection of over 50%. League average is closer to 40%. And a ERA projection by Steamer of 3.69 as a reliever, but also home run suppression, So 3.69 projection for Seymour, and for Ragsdale 3.78. So these are two guys who figure to be in that mix for either the bullpen or getting looks in the rotation. Just more strong young pitching. Both right-handers in their mid-20s, and they're in the mix now. Once you're on that 40-man, you are in the mix, and you can get called up at any time if needed. And so, you look at, I don't know, the Landon Roops and Tristan Becks and Randy Rodriguez's and Sean Jellies of the world. Like it's Keaton Wynn, it's this kind of guy. And when certain guys get injured, these are the guys who come up and get an opportunity. And some of them really flourish. And so we'll see with the Carsons. But on the flip side of that, the Giants did have to clear some space, and they did designate Kai-Wei Tang for assignment at the time when they added Ragsdale and Seymour to the 40-man. And then they non-tendered Kai-Wei Tang a few days later at the tender deadline. So he was still in DFA limbo, but when you non-tender somebody, they can't be claimed off waivers. And so that's the thing about non-tendering guys, is that they aren't subject to waiver claims. And so the Giants could look to re-sign Ethan Small and Kai-Wei Tang to minor league contracts, meaning not on the 40-man. So these guys are off the 40-man. Ragsdale and Seymour are on, and then of course, they tendered contracts to all these other players that I discussed earlier, including Yaz and Wade, etc. So anyway, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen today. For your second listen, find Locked On MLB. Baseball guru Sully brings a daily blend of humor and baseball, keeping you updated on every rumor and story throughout the offseason. Find Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter or X at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review. It helps me out a lot. So thank you in advance, and thanks to everyone who's done so already. Can't wait to be with you again later on this week. Thanks again for listening. You are now Locked On Giants.